They said my piano practice was noise pollution. Not just annoying, not just loud, pollution. Within weeks, I went from being the quiet neighbor at the end of the cul-de-sac to the main topic on every HOA agenda. Anonymous complaints, threatening letters, fines for disturbing the peace when I was practicing in the middle of the afternoon with my windows closed. So I did what they told me I could do. I followed the rules. I stopped practicing at home and started practicing only during HOA board meetings. Perfectly legal, perfectly timed, and very, very loud. What happens when you use their own bylaws to turn every meeting into a concert they can't shut down? I didn't move into this neighborhood to start a war. I moved in for the quiet. The street was the kind you see in real estate brochures, trimmed lawns, flower beds that all somehow bloomed around the same time, and neighbors who waved from their driveways but never got too close. It was predictable, safe, and, most importantly to me, calm enough that I could finally focus on one thing I'd always pushed aside: my music. The house itself wasn't anything fancy. 3 bedrooms, a small yard, and a living room with just enough space for one thing I really cared about: my upright piano. It wasn't new, it wasn't expensive, but it had history. I'd saved for it slowly, gig by gig, dollar by dollar, teaching kids scales in cramped apartments and playing background music in restaurants where no one was really listening. This house was supposed to be the place where all of that finally paid off. My days were simple. I worked from home, took walks in the late afternoon, and practiced in the early evenings, usually for an hour or two. Nothing dramatic, nothing wild. Scales, exercises, pieces I'd been trying to perfect for years. Sometimes I'd pause, hearing kids playing down the street, someone mowing their lawn, a dog barking at the mailman. It all blended into a normal neighborhood soundtrack. At first, it felt like I'd found my rhythm here. The neighbor across the street, an older man with a bright red pickup, always nodded when he saw me bringing in groceries. The couple next door kept mostly to themselves, but we exchanged the usual small talk about weather and trash pickup schedules. No one seemed bothered by anything, and honestly, I liked it that way. I didn't need best friends. I just needed peace. At the center of it all, though, was the HOA. You didn't really see them at first. They were more like a force than a group of people, mentioned in passing when someone talked about paint colors or fence heights. There was the monthly newsletter that showed up like clockwork, filled with reminders about trash can placement, acceptable holiday decorations, and lawn height limits, written in that overly friendly yet oddly threatening tone HOAs are famous for. I read it, shrugged, and filed it away. None of it really applied to me, I thought. I kept my yard neat. I parked where I was supposed to. I didn't have loud parties or leave junk on the curb. I was the last person who would cause trouble. And for a while, they seemed to agree. Months went by with nothing more serious than a flyer about community spirit and a note about someone not picking up after their dog. I saw a few board members at the park one weekend, polished, organized, the type who walked with clipboards and permanent frowns, but we never spoke. To them, I was just another quiet homeowner who paid dues on time. If anything, the only time anyone really noticed me was when my windows were open and the sound of the piano drifted outside on a breezy afternoon. Once, as I was playing, I glanced out and caught a woman walking her dog slowing down for a moment. She stood there for a beat, listening. Then she smiled slightly and kept going. No complaints, no glares, no issues. It made me believe my music fit into this place just fine. Inside my house, my routine became sacred. I'd make coffee, sit at my small kitchen table with my laptop, and work through emails and projects. At the end of the day, when my brain felt fried, I'd move to the piano. It wasn't just practice, it was therapy. Those keys had heard every version of me: stressed, hopeful, exhausted, relieved. In a neighborhood that felt a little too controlled, that piano was the one place where I felt completely free. But freedom and control don't usually coexist peacefully, especially where HOAs are concerned. I started noticing small signs first: things that didn't quite register as problems, but left a strange taste in my mouth. A car slowing down a little too much in front of my house, twice in the same week. A clipboard in the passenger seat. A man I didn't recognize standing at the end of the street during one of my afternoon practice sessions, glancing at my house, then quietly walking away. Then there were the newsletters. The tone shifted, just slightly. A new section appeared. Reminders on noise consideration. It didn't mention me by name, of course. It talked about respecting your neighbor's peace and quiet, and limiting repetitive or sustained noise during certain hours. At the bottom, in smaller print, it referenced the community bylaws on excessive or disruptive sounds. I read it twice. Technically, I was following all the rules. I didn't play early in the morning. I didn't play late at night. I wasn't blasting music through speakers or throwing parties. I was one person, at a piano, in the middle of the day, in my own home. It didn't even feel like something they should be thinking about. But once the word noise shows up in an HOA newsletter, it never really goes away. Around that time, I also started hearing more about the board meetings. Dates, times, reminders, all bolded and underlined. Your voice matters, the emails said. Attend our next HOA board meeting. I ignored them at first. I didn't have any complaints. I didn't have time to sit in a folding chair and listen to people argue about the color of someone's shutters. I had no idea those meetings would soon become the center of my entire life here. I had no idea that somewhere, in one of those rooms, my name, or at least my address, was already being discussed. Looking back, the warning signs were there. The subtle shift from, welcome to the community, to, remember the rules. The way the neighborhood seemed friendly, but also quietly monitored. The way people waved, but their eyes lingered just a bit too long, assessing, judging, mentally measuring whether you fit. For a while longer, I told myself I was imagining it, that I was overthinking, that no one in their right mind would have a serious problem with someone practicing a musical instrument in the middle of the day. But this was an HOA, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's that once they decide you're a problem, they'll find a rule to prove it. And my piano was about to become the excuse they'd been waiting for. The first sign that something was wrong arrived in a plain white envelope. It was tucked neatly into my mailbox between a coupon flyer and a utility bill, the HOA logo stamped in the corner like a warning label. I remember standing at my kitchen counter, slicing it open with a butter knife, expecting another generic reminder about lawn care or trash bins. Instead, I found my first notice of violation. It was only a single page, but it felt heavier than it should have. The wording was cold, clinical, and just vague enough to be unnerving. Dear homeowner, it began, it has come to the attention of the HOA board that there have been multiple complaints regarding excessive and repetitive noise originating from your property during daytime hours. Please be advised that such disturbances may constitute a violation of Section 7.4, Noise and Nuisance of the Community Bylaws. Multiple complaints, excessive and repetitive noise. They didn't say piano, they didn't say music, but I knew exactly what they meant. I reread it twice, my eyes drifting to the part at the bottom where they encouraged me to take immediate steps to remedy this issue, to avoid further action. Further action. That was their favorite phrase, though I didn't know it yet. It meant nothing and everything at the same time. And at first, I went through the usual emotions, confusion, then annoyance, then a kind of defensive anger. I practiced during the day, yes, but I was within reasonable hours. I wasn't blasting rock music at midnight. It was a piano, acoustic, no amplification. I thought of lawn mowers, leaf blowers, barking dogs, the normal soundtrack of suburban life. Somehow, I had become the problem. I tried to be reasonable. For the next week, I limited my practice even more. I finished before 5 p.m. I closed all my windows. I put a thick rug under the piano to absorb some of the sound. It felt ridiculous, but I did it anyway. I told myself that if someone was being overly sensitive, these changes would be enough to keep the peace. I wanted to be the good neighbor, the quiet one, the invisible one. 2 weeks later, another envelope showed up. This one had "Second Notice" in bold capital letters at the top. They appreciated my cooperation, but had received additional complaints about continuing disruptive noise. This time, there was a line that made my stomach twist. Failure to comply may result in monetary fines and further enforcement actions as outlined in the bylaws. Fines for practicing piano in my own home. The letter was signed by the HOA president, a name I'd seen but never really cared about, Linda Harper. I'd never met her in person, but I could picture her easily enough. Sharp haircut, clipboard, that look people get when they genuinely believe rules are more important than people. At the bottom of the letter, in neat print, they invited me to attend the next HOA board meeting to discuss the matter in a constructive manner. I didn't want to go. I knew those meetings by reputation. Uncomfortable chairs, passive-aggressive comments, people arguing over inches of fence height. I had no desire to add my piano to their list of grievances. But I also knew I couldn't keep ignoring this. If I didn't show up, they could say I was being uncooperative, that I didn't care about the community, and with fines on the line, their vague threats suddenly felt very real. So, I went. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a beige room with fluorescent lights and the faint smell of coffee and cleaning supplies. Rows of metal chairs were set up facing a folding table where 5 people sat, all with papers in front of them, all wearing that expression that said they'd taken this far too seriously for far too long. I recognized Linda immediately. She sat in the center, her posture straight, glasses perched at the end of her nose, a folder labeled "Agenda" in front of her. To her left and right were the vice president, treasurer, and 2 board members I'd never seen before. There were maybe a dozen other homeowners scattered around the room. Some looked bored, some irritated, some curious. As I walked in, a few heads turned. It felt like walking onto a stage I hadn't auditioned for. The meeting dragged through the usual topics: pool maintenance, parking violations, someone's fence color not matching the approved palette. My mind wandered. I kept wondering who, out of this group, had complained about me. Was it the couple next door? The man across the street? Someone further down, sitting there pretending they weren't listening? Finally, Linda cleared her throat and said, "Next on the agenda, we have a noise issue regarding 1428 Maple." My address. She didn't look at me when she said it. She read from her papers like she was reciting a script. "We've received multiple complaints over the past several weeks about loud, repetitive piano playing during the day. This has been described as disruptive and ongoing. We've sent 2 written notices, but it appears the issue has not been fully resolved." The way she said "piano playing" made it sound like a crime. My chest felt tight, but I raised my hand. "That's my address," I said. "I'm the one with the piano." Every head in the room turned toward me. I explained carefully that I only practiced during reasonable hours, that I'd already reduced my practice time, that I'd made changes to minimize the sound. I pointed out that there were no specific quiet hours in the bylaws that prohibited what I was doing. Linda listened with an expression that didn't change once. When I finished, she folded her hands and said, "We understand that you enjoy your music, but other residents have a right to quiet enjoyment of their homes." Quiet enjoyment. That phrase again. A man in the back suddenly chimed in. I recognized him as someone from 3 houses down. "My wife works nights," he said. "She sleeps during the day. That piano keeps her up. It's constant. It's not fair to her." I hadn't known that. No one had spoken to me about it. No one had knocked on my door or left a note. They'd gone straight to the board. I said as calmly as I could that if someone had told me I could have adjusted my practice schedule or limited the times even more. I wasn't trying to be inconsiderate. I just wished they'd come to me first instead of making it a formal complaint. Linda didn't care about that part. What she cared about was control. She referenced the bylaws, Section 7.4, Noise and Nuisance. It was vague on purpose. It forbid repetitive or disruptive sounds which interfere with the reasonable peace and comfort of other residents. That could mean anything: a vacuum cleaner, a barking dog, a TV, a piano. But the way she said it, it sounded like it was written just for me. "We're not asking you to stop playing entirely," she said. "We're simply requesting that you limit your practice to times that won't disturb others. Perhaps very short periods, no more than once or twice per week, or consider using a practice keyboard with headphones. Once or twice per week. For a musician, that's not practice, that's slow decay." I pointed out, again, that there were no specific quiet hours listed that I was violating. I asked point blank, "What are the exact hours you're saying I can't play?" Linda paused, a small crack in her polished tone. "We're not setting exact hours right now," she said. "We expect homeowners to use reasonable judgment. If complaints continue, the board is authorized to impose fines." So there it was, no clear rule, just a threat wrapped in formal language. The meeting moved on. They discussed landscaping budgets while my mind spun. I walked out of that room with something I hadn't expected to feel going in. Not shame, not guilt, but a cold, focused kind of anger. On the way home, I pulled up the HOA bylaws on my phone and read them carefully. Every section, every line, every vague phrase about reasonable expectations and community standards. They had rules, yes, but they also had limits. There were no stated quiet hours. There was nothing banning musical instruments. There was no rule against daytime practice. They could complain. They could send letters full of lawyerly wording. But if they wanted to fine me, they had to prove I'd broken an actual rule, not just annoyed someone. And that's when something in me shifted. Up until that point, I'd tried to shrink myself to fit their comfort. I played less. I closed my windows. I tried to be quieter, smaller, easier. But the meeting made it clear. It didn't matter how much I tried. As long as one or two people were annoyed, I'd always be one envelope away from another threat. So if I was going to be the villain in their little story, I might as well make it count. Over the next week, the letters escalated. First, there was a final warning, informing me that continued non-compliance would result in fines of $50 per incident. No definition of incident. No clear line I could avoid crossing. Then came the first fine, $50, charged to my account for ongoing excessive noise, as documented by resident complaints on the following dates and times, followed by a list. I recognized those dates. I'd been extra careful those days, practicing only in the late afternoon, never in the evening. If that still counted as excessive noise, then there was no way to win. I appealed the fine, of course. I wrote a detailed email citing the bylaws, pointing out that no specific rule had been broken. I requested documentation, proof, anything beyond "someone said so." I copied the entire board. No one responded. Days passed. Another fine appeared. That's when my frustration solidified into something else: strategy. If they wanted to use their bylaws as a weapon, then I would use those same bylaws as my shield. They loved rules. They hid behind them. They brandished them like swords. But those rules worked both ways. Buried in the dense, boring text of the HOA's own documents, I found exactly what I needed: the section about common area usage and another about quiet hours. Quiet hours, it turned out, only applied to outdoor common spaces, pool, park, playground, after 10 p.m. and before 7 a.m. There was nothing about daytime noise inside a private residence. But there was also this: board meetings were required to be open to all homeowners, held in designated common areas, and could not restrict normal, lawful activity during the posted meeting times, as long as it did not violate any specific bylaw. No specific bylaw banned musical performance during meetings. It clicked all at once. If they claimed my piano was noise pollution but couldn't point to a rule that actually made it illegal, then I could, in theory, practice anywhere and any time that was technically allowed, including during their meetings, especially during their meetings. The next HOA newsletter went out with the usual chirpy tone, and at the bottom, a small note: Next HOA board meeting, Thursday 7 p.m. Community Clubhouse, all homeowners welcome. I circled the date on my calendar. In the days leading up to it, I didn't change anything about my routine. I still practiced at home in the late afternoons, quietly, controlled, just like I always had. If they sent more fines, I noted them, added them to a growing stack of printouts, and kept reading their own rules like a playbook. But on the night of the meeting, I did something different. I loaded my sheet music into a tote bag. Not the soft, gentle pieces. Not the quiet etudes. I chose the big pieces, the ones with dramatic chords, rolling arpeggios, and powerful dynamics. The kind of music that filled a room and left no space for idle chatter. Then I grabbed my digital keyboard. It was full-sized, weighted keys with built-in speakers. Portable enough to carry, loud enough to be heard across a medium-sized room, and most importantly, it wasn't banned anywhere in their bylaws. I walked into the clubhouse 5 minutes before the meeting started, keyboard case slung over my shoulder, bag of sheet music in hand. The room fell quiet. Every eye followed me as I walked to the side, near an outlet, and started setting up. I didn't say anything. I didn't explain. I just placed the keyboard on its stand, plugged it in, and stacked my music neatly on top. Linda stared at me from the front of the room, her expression flickering for a second from confusion to something darker. But she didn't say a word. Not yet. Technically, I wasn't doing anything wrong. Not yet. The meeting started. She called it to order, launched into the agenda, tried to pretend the keyboard wasn't there. A few homeowners kept glancing at me, whispering to each other. I waited. I let them get through the first 2 items, budget updates, pool repairs, before I calmly sat down at the keyboard, opened my music to the first piece, and placed my hands on the keys. I checked the time. It was 7:18 p.m., well within normal hours, in a common area. During an open meeting, I had every right to attend. Then, without a word, I started to play. And that was when their precious rules stopped working the way they thought they would. Because for the first time, the noise wasn't coming from behind my living room walls. It was coming from their house, their meeting, their control. And they had no idea how to make it stop without breaking the very bylaws they'd been using against me. The first chord rang out like a challenge. It wasn't timid or hesitant. It was full, rich, and deliberate, the kind of sound that demanded attention. Heads that had been bowed over printouts snapped up. Conversations that were already half-hearted died mid-sentence. The clubhouse was not a big room, and the keyboard speakers were more than enough to fill it. The notes bounced off the beige walls and cheap ceiling tiles, layering over Linda's voice as she tried to continue reading from the agenda. She raised her volume. I raised mine. I wasn't smashing the keys. I wasn't being childish or chaotic. I was playing, clean, precise, controlled, the kind of playing that, in any other setting, would be considered a performance. Here, though, here it was suddenly something else, a mirror. Everything they'd called a nuisance in my house now lived in theirs. For a few seconds, no one moved. The board members glanced at each other, unsure who should act first. Some homeowners looked uncomfortable. Others looked entertained, curiosity flickering at the edges of their posture as they watched the scene unfold. Linda finally set her papers down. "Excuse me," she said loudly, though her voice was almost swallowed by the swell of the music. "You'll need to stop doing that. We're in a meeting." I didn't look at her. I didn't answer. I simply kept playing, the piece building in complexity, left hand rolling through low chords, right hand dancing over the top. It was beautiful and, more importantly, undeniably loud. She tried again, this time sharper. "You are disrupting official HOA business. This is not appropriate. You'll need to turn that off." I let the phrase I was playing finish naturally, then, for the first time, looked up at her. "Am I violating a bylaw?" I asked calmly, hands still resting lightly on the keys. "Because if I am, you're free to cite it. If not, I'm just a homeowner using a common area during posted hours." Same as you." The room went still. No one had ever spoken to her like that in a meeting. You could feel it in the way the tension shifted, like the air pressure dropping before a storm. The other board members turned to Linda, waiting to see how she'd handle this new, unexpected kind of resistance. Her jaw tightened. "You are causing a disturbance," she said. "You're intentionally interfering with community governance. That is not the same thing as simply being present." I shrugged slightly. Section 7.4 is about noise that interferes with the reasonable peace and comfort of residents in their homes, I replied. This is a public, common area at a time you've specifically invited homeowners to attend. There's no bylaw stating I can't play music here. There's no posted quiet hours for the clubhouse at 7 p.m. I let my fingers drift back to the keys. And as your letters have reminded me, you enforce the bylaws. You don't invent them. Then I started the next passage, louder, faster, more intense. This time, I didn't stop. Linda tried to raise her voice over the sound, but it was pointless. The music rolled through the room like a wave. A few people in the back fought smiles. One man, who'd been slumped in his chair checking his phone when I'd first walked in, now sat upright, watching me with a look that said he'd been waiting for someone to do this for a long time. The board huddled for a moment, whispering among themselves. My music became the background to their panic. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd turned my life into a series of tense letters and closed-door conversations. And now here they were, cornered into having their own whispered emergency meeting, on display in front of everyone. Finally, Linda turned back to me with a brittle smile. "Fine," she said loudly. "If you insist on being disruptive, we'll have to have you removed. We are within our rights to ask you to leave this private HOA function." I let a fast run of notes finish, then stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt heavy. Her composure cracked then, just for a second. You could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She knew I was right, but she wasn't used to being challenged in public, especially not with chapter and verse citations of the rules she so casually weaponized. Before she could respond, a voice from the side spoke up. "Actually," he said, holding up a copy of the bylaws, "he's correct. Page 16. Board meetings must be open to all homeowners, and use of the common area cannot be restricted unless safety or capacity is an issue. There's nothing here about musical instruments." He wasn't defending me because he liked me. He was defending me because he liked the rules more, and that was exactly what I needed. I looked at Linda again. "So," I said almost gently, "am I violating a rule, or am I just annoying you?" Her cheeks flushed. "This is harassment," she snapped. "You are retaliating against the board because you've received fines. That is absolutely not acceptable. You're making a spectacle of this community's business." I almost laughed at that. The woman who'd turned my practice sessions into a series of formal violations was suddenly upset about optics. "I'm just practicing," I said. "At a reasonable hour, where everyone can hear it. Just like you said I was doing at home. Only here, we all get to see how excessive it really is." And then I made the smallest, most deliberate move of the entire night. I reached into my bag, pulled out my phone, and set it on the edge of the keyboard, screen facing up. The red recording light blinked to life. This was the moment everything shifted, and everyone knew it. Up until now, they'd controlled the narrative, their letters, their interpretation of the rules, their private discussions about which homeowner was a problem. But now, the stage was theirs, the lights were on, and for the first time, they were the ones on the defensive. Linda did what people like her do when they feel power slipping through their fingers. She tried to double down. "The fines will stand," she said stiffly. "Your continued disruptive behavior will be noted, and the board will take whatever steps are necessary to maintain order in this community. If that includes legal action, so be it." Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her, fingers tapping too quickly on the table, a pen twisting back and forth. "Legal action?" I repeated, my voice low but steady. Over what? Piano practice that doesn't violate a single written rule? Or over this? I gestured around with one hand, still resting the other on the keyboard. A homeowner attending a public meeting and using a common area in a lawful way. I glanced at the others. Because if you're talking about legal action, I've already spoken to an attorney. And they were very interested in the idea of selective enforcement and harassment. Rules applied vaguely to some people and not others, like a subjective noise standard enforced against one quiet homeowner with a piano, while dogs bark all day and lawn crews run leaf blowers every week. That part wasn't entirely bluff. I hadn't hired anyone yet, but I had made a consultation call. I'd taken notes. I'd learned the phrases that mattered. Selective enforcement, harassment, retaliation. Words that turned petty power plays into liability. You could feel the word attorney hit the room like another chord. One of the board members shifted forward, suddenly looking very interested in his own shoes. Another cleared his throat as if he wanted to speak but thought better of it. Even the man with the bylaws in his hand now looked less like an ally and more like someone calculating fallout. It's not harassment, Linda said, but there was no energy behind it now. We have complaints. We have the right to respond. Then respond evenly, I said. Show me the complaint logs. Show me every dog barking complaint, every complaint about power tools, every party. Show me every fine issued for daytime noise, not just mine. Because if I'm the only one, then I'm not the problem. Your process is. Silence. I could have stopped there. I could have packed up, walked out, left them stewing in their discomfort. But I wasn't done. Not yet. You know what the funny thing is? I said softly, letting my hands hover over the keys. You could have knocked on my door. You could have said, "Hey, someone's working nights. Could you avoid practicing at these times?" I would have worked with you. I did work with you. I reduced my practice. I made changes. But that wasn't enough. You needed control. You needed to make an example. I met Linda's eyes. So I decided to become the example. Then I started to play again. But this time, it wasn't just defiance. It was demonstration. I chose a quieter piece, still clear and present, but gentler. The notes moved through the air like a calm explanation. Everyone in that room could hear it. Everyone could judge for themselves. Was this truly noise pollution? Or had someone's personal annoyance been elevated into an official crusade? I watched faces as I played. Some looked awkward, as if they were seeing for the first time how disproportionate the board's response had been. A few nodded slightly, not in solidarity with me necessarily, but in recognition of something they'd probably felt themselves, that this place had become less about community and more about control. I let the last notes fade naturally, the sound thinning into stillness. No one spoke. For the first time since I'd moved into the neighborhood, the silence felt earned, not enforced. I reached over, tapped my phone to stop the recording, and gently closed my music book. So, I said quietly, if we're going to talk about noise, fines, and bylaws, maybe we should start by talking about fairness. And with that, I picked up my keyboard, turned, and began to walk toward the door. I didn't need to stay for the rest of the meeting, because by then, the real work was already done. The music had stopped, but the echoes, in that room, in that board, and across the entire neighborhood, were just getting started. When I walked out of that clubhouse with my keyboard slung over my shoulder, it felt like leaving a battlefield. Not because I'd won. I honestly didn't know if I had yet. But because for the first time, I hadn't been the one retreating. I hadn't shrunk myself down, apologized for existing, or quietly swallowed another thinly veiled threat. I'd walked in with their rules and walked out with their attention. The next morning, I expected the first wave of fallout. Angry emails, a certified letter, maybe even some petty gesture like a violation for unauthorized equipment in the clubhouse, something ridiculous and desperate. Instead, the first response came from somewhere I didn't expect at all. My neighbors. It started small. I was taking my trash can to the curb when a woman I'd seen jogging past my house 100 times slowed down and stopped. "I was at the meeting last night," she said, a little out of breath. "I just wanted to say that was something." For a moment, I didn't know how to respond. I half expected her to launch into a lecture about noise or civility, but she just shook her head and let out a short laugh. "They've been like this for years," she said. "Not always about noise, fences, garden decorations, parking. They pick someone, latch onto a rule, and just don't let go." She paused. "Most of us just roll over. You didn't." There was something almost like gratitude in her voice. That conversation repeated itself in different forms over the next few days. The man who lived 3 houses down, the one whose wife worked nights, caught me at the mailbox one afternoon. I braced myself, already forming a plan to offer actual compromise, maybe specific practice times that would make her life easier. Instead, he surprised me. "Look," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "I did complain. I won't pretend I didn't. It was rough on her for a while." He met my eyes. "But I didn't ask them to handle it like that. I thought they'd just talk to you. I didn't know it'd turn into all of that." He looked embarrassed, like someone who'd set a small fire and then watched it become a forest blaze. He nodded toward my house. "If we worked something out between us, like certain hours you avoid or days, that'd be enough for us. You don't have to stop completely." He hesitated. "And for what it's worth, that was impressive. What you did at the meeting." That was the part the board had miscalculated. They'd tried to make my piano into a symbol of disobedience. Instead, they'd turned me into something else, proof that you could push back and the sky wouldn't fall. I took his offer seriously. I told him I'd shift my practice on specific days so his wife could sleep, and he promised to tell her directly instead of filtering everything through the HOA. A normal conversation between 2 adults that could have happened at the beginning and saved everyone months of stress. It was almost funny if it hadn't been so exhausting. But the real consequence of that night didn't show up in conversation. It showed up in paper. 2 days after the meeting, an email from the HOA landed in my inbox. The subject line was bland and careful: clarification of community noise guidelines. The body of the email read like an attempt at a reset. It began with the familiar, overly polite tone. "Dear residents, we value your comfort. We strive to maintain a peaceful community." But buried in the middle was the change I'd been waiting for. After receiving feedback and questions regarding our noise and nuisance policies, it read, "The board would like to clarify that casual, normal household noise during daytime hours, including musical practice, children playing, and standard yard maintenance, is generally considered acceptable, provided it does not extend into early morning or late-night quiet hours. Specific cases may still be reviewed, but fines will only be considered when clear, repeated, and egregious violations occur." They'd never admitted they were wrong. They didn't say, "We overstepped," or "We misapplied the rule." But they had effectively walked back the broad, undefined standard they'd used as a weapon. Now, normal noise was not an offense by default, and fines were something they had to justify, not something they could toss around as a first option. At the very bottom, in much smaller text, was another line. "Homeowners with ongoing concerns or unresolved violations are encouraged to contact the board directly to review their case." I didn't wait. I attached copies of every violation letter, every fine notice, and a screenshot of the new email. Then I wrote, "Per your updated clarification, my daytime piano practice clearly falls under normal household noise. I request that all previous fines levied against my account for this issue be reversed and removed from my record. If this is not done within 10 business days, I will proceed with the documentation I have already collected for a formal complaint and potential legal review for harassment and selective enforcement." This time, I didn't just send it to the generic HOA address. I CC'd every board member individually. I CC'd the property management company. I even CC'd myself from a second email address I rarely used, just to have a time-stamped duplicate. For 3 days, there was silence. Then a response. It came from the management company, not Linda herself. After reviewing the circumstances and considering recent policy clarifications, the board has elected, as a courtesy, to waive and remove all existing fines associated with the reported noise complaints for your property. A courtesy. That word made me roll my eyes so hard it almost hurt. But I kept reading. Please note that this does not constitute an admission of error or change in the board's right to enforce community standards. We appreciate your cooperation in helping maintain a respectful environment for all residents. No apology, no acknowledgement of how they'd escalated something minor into a campaign. But the fines were gone. That was the part I could take to the bank. Literally. No more surprise charges on my HOA statement. No more threats hanging over my head for touching a piano key between noon and 5. And as much as they tried to frame it as a favor, it wasn't. It was a retreat. They backed off because they knew this wasn't just about my noise, it was about their pattern. And I had put that pattern on display in a room full of witnesses with a recording that, as far as they knew, could be uploaded, emailed, even forwarded to someone with a legal letterhead. But the impact didn't stop with me. The next board meeting was different. I didn't bring the keyboard. I didn't need to. My point had already been made. What I did bring was something else. A chair in the front row, a copy of the bylaws, and a notebook. I didn't say much, not at first. I just watched, listened. Whenever someone brought up a rule, I checked it. Whenever a homeowner was told, "We can't allow that," I quietly flipped through the pages to see if "can't" meant not allowed or we don't like it. And here's where something interesting happened. I wasn't the only one doing it. 2 of my neighbors, people I'd never pegged as the get-involved type, showed up with their own copies of the bylaws printed out, highlighted, tabbed with sticky notes. They'd seen what happened at the last meeting and decided they were done, nodding along to the board's interpretations without question. The power dynamic had shifted, just a bit, not enough to overthrow the HOA, but enough that their authority wasn't assumed anymore. It had to be justified. During one meeting, a woman was told she couldn't put a small bench on her front porch because it violated aesthetic harmony. The board cited some vague section about unapproved exterior structures. She looked nervous, ready to accept it. Then the man who'd stood up with the bylaws on my behalf raised his hand again. "Where exactly is that defined?" he asked. "Because if we're enforcing it, it should be specific. We can't fine someone for a bench if we can't even agree on what aesthetic harmony means in writing." He wasn't doing it for her bench. He was doing it because he'd seen what happened when vague rules were used against one person, and he recognized the pattern trying to repeat itself. That's how real change starts in places like this, not with a full-scale rebellion, but with small acts of resistance that refuse to let authority go unquestioned. As for Linda, you might be wondering what happened to her. She didn't quit immediately. People like her rarely do. They double down, then quietly reposition themselves. For a while, she tried to act as if nothing had happened. Her emails stayed chirpy, her meetings stayed structured, her posture stayed straight. But the edge was gone. The absolute certainty, the unshakable belief that every decision she made would go uncontested. A few months later, tucked casually into a newsletter between an announcement about holiday decorations and a reminder about trash can placement, there was this line. "We would like to thank Linda Harper for her years of service as HOA president. Linda has stepped down from her role but will remain a valued member of our community. Vice President Mark Ellis will be serving as interim president until the next election." No explanation, no drama, but people talk. I'd hear bits and pieces from neighbors, that she was tired of the stress, that people were becoming too combative, that it wasn't worth the hassle anymore. Maybe all of that was true, or maybe, for the first time, she realized that wielding power without pushback was a luxury she no longer had. Either way, she wasn't in charge anymore. Under the new interim president, things didn't suddenly become perfect. This was still an HOA after all. There were still forms, rules, petty arguments over flower beds and trash cans. But there was a bit more transparency, a bit more willingness to talk things through before mailing out threats, and most importantly, there was a very clear, unspoken understanding. If you turn a molehill into a mountain, someone might just bring a keyboard to the summit. Back at my house, life slowly settled into something like normal. I practiced again. Not defiantly, not pointedly, just because I loved it. Because that's what the piano had always been to me before all of this. Not a weapon, not a protest, but an outlet. Therapy in 88 keys. I still kept my promise to the neighbor whose wife worked nights. I adjusted my schedule on certain days, avoided specific times, checked in now and then to make sure things were okay. That wasn't compromise born of fear. It was consideration chosen freely. That's the difference rules can never capture. The gap between what you do because you're threatened and what you do because you're decent. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the windows were open and the air was soft, I'd catch sight of someone walking past my house, slowing down just a little to listen. No one glared. No one took out their phone to document anything. No envelopes appeared in my mailbox labeled Notice. One Saturday afternoon, as I was finishing a piece, someone knocked on my door. It was the jogger, the woman who'd spoken to me after that first post-meeting trash run. She smiled, a little shyly. "My niece is learning piano," she said. "She lives a couple streets over. She heard about everything. She asked if the piano neighbor ever gives lessons." For a second, I just stood there. Months earlier, my music had been labeled pollution, a nuisance, evidence of a problem homeowner. Now, it was something someone wanted to learn from. "I do teach," I said, "if she doesn't mind a somewhat infamous address." The joke landed. We both laughed. Her niece started coming by once a week. At first, she was more interested in the story than the scales. "Did you really bring a keyboard to the meeting?" Were they mad? But eventually, the focus shifted back where it belonged, on the music. Sometimes, as she played her hesitant, clumsy beginner pieces, I'd hear someone's lawnmower start up down the street. A dog would bark, a car would pass with its radio just a bit too loud, normal noise. Life, happening. Exactly what it should have been all along. Looking back, it would be easy to frame this as just a petty war over a piano. And on the surface, that's what it was. A musician versus an HOA. Practice sessions versus paper notices. Keys versus clipboards. But underneath, it was something bigger. It was about how easily power can warp into control when no one questions it. How one person's annoyance can become official policy if the rest of us stay quiet. How a rule written to protect peace can be twisted into a tool for punishment. And how, sometimes, the most effective way to fight back isn't by breaking the rules, it's by knowing them better than the people who wrote them. So if you're watching this and thinking about your own version of this story, the letter about the wrong flowers, the threat over a faded mailbox, the notice about kids chalking the sidewalk, the friendly reminder that sounds more like a warning, ask yourself this: is the problem really you? Or is it the way someone has decided that their comfort is more important than your life? Because maybe, just maybe, the real noise pollution in these neighborhoods isn't the sound of a piano, or kids laughing, or a lawnmower at 3 p.m. Maybe it's the constant hum of people who think a title and a binder full of bylaws gives them the right to decide how everyone else should live. And here's the part they never see coming. The moment you stop being afraid of that noise, the moment you start reading those rules, asking those questions, showing up to those meetings, that's the moment their power stops being absolute. In my case, it took a keyboard at an HOA meeting to prove that. In yours, it might be something smaller, quieter, an email, a question, a simple, calm, "Show me where that's written." But it starts the same way, with the decision that you don't exist in your own home at someone else's convenience. So the next time someone tells you that your normal, everyday life is a nuisance, that your presence is a problem, that your joy is noise, ask yourself, Are you really disturbing the peace? Or are you just finally refusing to live silently?